ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the 286 Project with me, Chris Akers. On this podcast, we talk about arts, culture, politics, sport, and anything else worth talking about. If you like this interview and if you like the subsequent interviews, then please like, subscribe, and all that good stuff. Today's guest is a returning guest. Last time we spoke about his book, Boston Tabloid, which was concerning about crime in Boston many decades ago. This time we're talking about boxing in particular. It's Don Stradley, and I'm pleased to have him on the podcast. Hello, Dom.
Hello, Chris. Good to see you again.
Likewise, likewise. So, first off, before we get into your book, because even though we talked about true crime in your last time you were here, I first know you through boxing. So, be able to just do a very brief synopsis of your boxing career. Like, how long have you been writing about the sport now?
Oh, I started writing for the Ring magazine, which is a very big American publication. I think it's the oldest American publication. It was started in the 1920s, so it's a century old. I started writing for them about 20 years ago, and I had written some stuff online, and some people at the Ring saw it. Nigel Collins and Bill Detloff. They started reading my material online, and one thing led to another, and I was invited to write for the Ring, and I'm still doing it 20 years later. So that's been a great experience. I learned a lot, not just about boxing, but also about journalism, because I was surrounded by some really top flight writers. Uh, so for me, it's never just been about boxing. I've sort of been interested in all types of journalism, all types of writing. The boxing did consume a lot of time,
Yeah,
and I've enjoyed it. Um, and yeah, for a long time, they would send me to cover fights in New York and Rhode Island, because I'm on the East Coast of the United States. So I was covering a lot of fights in my area. Um, and things have changed a little bit because the Ring changed ownership, and but somehow I'm always in the lineup, so I'm happy for that.
cool, cool. So you have a new book out called Immortals of Boxing, which I've read some of it. I haven't read all of it. The Immortals of American Boxing, and that's an important distinction, which we'll get to later. But what prompted you to write this book?
Chris, it was a, a strange set of circumstances that brought this book on. Um, a publisher out of Australia called Rockpool Publishing. They had done a series of books about Australian sports, rugby, cricket, soccer, horse racing, all the sports that are very popular in Australia. And they were nicely bound, beautifully put together uh, books. Um, you might call them gift books. They're very colorful, beautiful color photos. They're very nice. And an American distributor, Simon and Schuster, approached them and said, "We'd like to distribute your books in America. Why don't you do some American sports?" And somehow boxing was proposed, and someone in the Australian office knew about me. They knew my Hagler Hearns book, and they had heard me on a couple of podcasts. They knew about me, and they just contacted me, and they made the pitch. They said, "We want to do a boxing book for our series," and at first I hesitated because my first thought was there are already quite a few good boxing books out there of this type, you know, and I had them all when I was a kid, you know. That's how I learned about boxing. And I thought, did I really want to do another one when there are so many good ones out there? But it only took about a day of thinking it over. And I thought, this is my chance to write that type of book. the type of
Mhm.
book that I had always enjoyed when I was a young fan, just learning about boxing, and I would I would always go to those sort of uh, oversized encyclopedia type books that always had pictures of the old timers, and it really appealed to me. And I thought, okay, this is my chance to sort of complete the circle. You know, the stuff that I used to read when I was a kid. Um, I realized those are all pretty old books, and they're really not available anymore. A lot of them are out of print.
Mhm.
You might find them in a used bookstore or on eBay or something. And I thought, well, here's my chance to write a new one that's similar to it. I'll put my spin on it. Um, and I ended up really enjoying the project, and would like to give a shout out to the publishers, Rockpool Publishing in Australia. And the imprint for the sports books is called the Gelding Street Press. They put out nice books, and I'll show you the cover again, and I'll
Yeah.
flip through some of the pictures. They have a lot of nice photographs, and it's just a nicely put together book, you know. And I was very proud to be part of it. And that's how it came about.
Cool. So what is the concept of the book? Because it's more than, I would say, a greatest American boxers of all time. There is that to a certain degree, but there's a little bit more to it than that. I imagine it'd be fair to say.
Right. The publisher had already initiated this series called The Immortals. You know, they had the Immortals of football, the Immortals of horse racing. So to do the Immortals of boxing, I didn't necessarily just want to make a list of, the 20 greatest fighters, or the 20 best left jabs. I
Yeah,
didn't want to get into that kind of thing. I didn't want to make a pound for pound list, or I didn't want to get bogged down in saying that, this guy is better than that guy. That really wasn't interesting to me. I sort of had to come up with uh, a list of things that I think made a fighter, immortal, you know, um, and it combined a lot of things. It wasn't just popularity, okay, though popularity is part of it. But say someone like Ray Boom Boom Mancini, okay,
mhm,
or Arturo Gatti. These were very popular fighters, and I could say they were important fighters, but I wouldn't put them in that same category of being immortal like I would with a Jack Dempsey
mhm,
or Muhammad Ali. I really wanted to focus on fighters who had transcended the business, and their name meant something outside of boxing. Um, it became a real chore almost to think, well, some fighters that I really liked, they don't really make that distinction, you know.
mm,
Particularly with the more modern fighters uh, who don't really cut into the mainstream. One of my criterions was that um, if someone who's not a boxing fan knows the guy's name, that was important.
mm,
Because a lot of fighters are popular within boxing, but they don't really mean much outside of boxing.
mm.
You know, and I would even put Floyd Mayweather in.
As I was going to ask you, yeah, because he's off the list, and I was thinking, oh, okay, that's
Yeah,
interesting.
he's like the last name in the
Mm,
book, you know, because he was big in boxing, but outside of boxing, I don't know if he registers with anybody. Now I think with because the book focused on America, that was my vision. Um, a British book, for instance, would be different. I think in the modern era, I think British fighters come into the mainstream a little more than American fighters do.
yeah. Yeah.
You know, I think Tyson Fury is huge in England. You
Mm.
know, whereas America's last good heavyweight, who would it be? Deontay Wilder. you know, he
Yeah.
did not really break into the mainstream at all. He was a boxing figure. You know, so that became uh, part of the judgment that I had with fighters. I mean, there in the older days of boxing, when the heavyweight champion made a successful title defense, the president of the United States would call him after the fight. You know,
Yeah.
it was that big. Boxing used to be uh, much more of a mainstream American pastime, and lately it's not so much that way. But I wanted to give some coverage to that period of time where boxing really was a mainstream sport in America, and everybody knew the heavyweight champion's name. They knew the middleweight champion's name. They,
Yeah.
you'd open the sports pages of your daily newspaper, and it really surprises me sometimes. Even a relatively unimportant fight would get coverage in the daily newspapers back 30, 40, 50 years ago. It's kind of interesting to think about it that way. But that helped cutting my list down because I could only pick 15 fighters for the main part of the book. And then I had another 15 or 16 sort of runner up, honorable mention types in the back of the book. Um, and I wasn't afraid to give the old timers a little bit of coverage. Some people might have focused more on maybe after World War II, or maybe more focused on the 80s or 90s. For instance, some people might have put Roy Jones in the book. I chose not to, or Bernard Hopkins. To me, those guys, they were great in their time. I don't know if they're great all time. You know,
Mm.
they with no disrespect to either guy, I don't know if we'll be talking about Bernard Hopkins in the future. You know,
Mm.
um, it's just a different time. You know, boxers don't leave the type of imprint that they used to. And some people might say I focus too much on the old timers, but uh, as time rolls on, I felt like this is really probably the last time the old timers are going to get a mention.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
They're going to be put in museums, you know, in the back of the museum, so to speak. Their time is gradually moving into ancient history. So I wanted to pull those guys out one more time, like John L. Sullivan and Stanley Ketchel and Harry Greb. I wanted to pull them out maybe one last time before that door closes entirely.
Mm. One name, as you were speaking, I just thought of, who isn't on the list. And if you talk about transcending, I don't know what it's like in America, I imagine it's massive, is Oscar de la Hoya.
Right.
Because he started, similar to Sugar Ray Leonard, in that he became popular for winning a gold medal at the Barcelona Olympics in '92. But I imagine in America, even though it's popular, would be fair to say he didn't quite transcend in the way a lot of these other boxers did.
At one point, De La Hoya was on my list uh,
Okay.
to be mentioned at the end of the book. Um, it goes at the end of the book. I mention a lot of runner-up type names, and De La Hoya, he was on my list, but he didn't make the cut. He transcended the game for Mexican American fans. That's for sure. He did transcend for a very short time, but again, kind of like Bernard Hopkins. I don't know if we'll still be talking about De La Hoya in the far future. It's hard to say. Um, there were fighters in the 80s and 90s that I thought we would still be talking about now, and it seems like people are less concerned with history than they used to be. Now it's
Yeah.
like a fighter retires and he kind of wanders off into the darkness, and then we forget about him, you know. Whereas before, we, as boxing fans, we did still kind of blow the trumpets for these guys, even in retirement, you know. And it used to be such a big deal to see them at ringside when they retired. You know,
Yeah.
they'd be introduced at ringside, and the fans would stand up and give them a big reaction. You know, it was they'd be invited into the ring to shake hands with the
Mhm.
the two guys who were about to fight. It was almost like um, what do you call, a pageantry about it with the old time
Mm.
fighters. And now you only get that occasionally. You know, you might get it at the Hall of Fame inductions. Um, you know, but it's not quite what it used to be. But De La Hoya came very close to being uh, part of the book. Um, I wish De La Hoya had been maybe a little more active in the second half of his career.
Yeah.
It seemed like he would. The first half of his career was excellent, but then the second half of his career, he kind of couldn't figure out what weight class he wanted to be in, and he was holding out for like just the really big money fights, and never really stayed in one spot for too long. And I mean, that was his career, and he was managing it the way he thought best. Um, but I think if he'd have just stayed in a division and defended it a few times, rather than saying, "All right, now I'll go up to middleweight, and then I'll come back down and fight Manny Pacquiao, and then I'll do this, and then I'll do that," uh, I think he hurt himself, and he maybe hurt his chances of getting into a book like that. On the other hand, someone else may have written this book, and they would have put De La Hoya right up front. You never know.
Yeah, indeed. So let's go through them because there's like half of them which fought had their peaks before the war, before Second World War. About six of them. And obviously you mentioned John L. Sullivan there. Jack Johnson seems a very obvious one as well. And in fact, with Jack Johnson, this is another thing I was going to ask you because, especially with his book Unforgiven of Blackness, which is a brilliant book. Again, with boxing, it tends to be something that transcends a lot of people because of the books are written about it, the movies are made about it. Did it have a massive influence in regards to the list that you made? Because a lot of those people might have transcended themselves after, say, a movie came out of their lives.
Oh yeah, that was certainly the case with Jack Johnson, because when he retired and then he passed away, he died in a car accident. Um, he became one of those sort of forgotten characters. But in the 1960s, uh, there was a big, sort of a celebration of his name,
Mhm.
partly because, or mostly because, there was a Broadway play called The Great White Hope,
Mhm.
and then it was turned into a movie. But it was really the Broadway play that starred James Earl Jones
Yeah.
as a character, kind of like Jack Johnson. They gave him a different name. They called him Jack Jefferson.
Mhm.
Um, but that play, The Great White Hope, because it came out around the same time as the civil rights movement in America, Johnson became this sort of galvanizing figure. A lot of black college students were putting up posters in their dorm rooms of Jack Johnson, or of the play The Great White Hope. He became for a while. Jack Johnson became this figure that they would put him alongside Muhammad Ali or Malcolm X or other black activists. He became that sort of character, and that really kind of resurrected his career.
Mhm.
Prior to that play, you didn't hear that much about Jack Johnson, uh, because he had been fighting in 1915 So his name didn't come up that often. And then when Muhammad Ali came out of retirement in 1970, or he came back from his exile,
Hmm.
um, he started talking about Jack Johnson, uh, you know, as sort of um, a brother in arms type of thing, and because Ali had gone to see The Great White Hope on Broadway. Um, so with Jack Johnson, it was the media that sort of kept his legend alive. I think if that play had never come out, I think Jack Johnson might be remembered as just kind of an old time fighter. He would get some kudos for being the first black heavyweight champion, but without that play on Broadway, uh, I don't know if he would have uh, stayed in the public's imagination all through the 70s and 80s, up to when Ken Burns made a documentary about him, and when that book came out, The Unforgivable Blackness, um, to even Donald Trump pardoning him for the situation that had started all of his problems back, more than a century ago. Um, it, uh, it's amazing what that will do. There are other fighters who certainly deserved a play or a movie. you know, a similar thing happened with Jake LaMotta. When you think about it,
Yeah.
when Raging Bull came out, Jake LaMotta's name suddenly, I think, tripled in in, in
Yeah.
status. Nobody was talking about Jake LaMotta before that movie came out, and afterwards he became almost like a sainted character in a way. Before that, nobody liked him. He was not
Mm.
popular at all. He was a guy who had thrown a fight, and he was a guy who caused a lot of trouble, and did some time in prison. He was not a beloved character. Yet I remember one time I was at the Boxing Hall of Fame in New York, and they have a parade on Sunday morning. And the car that went by with LaMotta was sitting in the back seat waving at everybody. And people were on the sidewalk yelling, God bless you, Jake. We love you, Jake. And I'm thinking, this was a guy who beat up his wife and took a
Yeah.
dive. He was not a lovable character, but it was the power of that movie, Raging Bull, that, like I said, it just elevated his name into something that it wasn't before. But uh, there are some characters in the book. I call them characters. There are some fighters in the book who didn't get movies made. For instance, Benny Leonard,
Yeah.
uh, the great lightweight of the 1920s, the great lightweight of the 1920s, Benny Leonard. No movies were made of him. I don't think there's really been a book about him. There may have been some books about him, but nothing like Unforgivable Blackness or anything like that. Um, Same thing with Harry Greb. I put Harry Greb in the top 15. Um, no movies about Harry Greb, though you could make one. He had an interesting life. Um, so in some cases, the media helped. That's for sure with my choices, but um, there were some guys in there who really didn't get much media help.
It's interesting because one of us going to talk about was Jack Dempsey because he was married to a film star at his peak, and then that fell apart. The match ended, and then he was accused of dodging the draft when the war broke out. So talk about transcendence. He might have transcended his sport at his peak, but then his reputation kind of went downhill after that, and he didn't really recover outside of boxing. Would that be a fair assessment to say?
With Dempsey, it was funny because his image was so big, he didn't even have to fight. He could just make personal appearances and
Mm.
make a lot of money that way, you know, or he could do a little sparring engagement somewhere, fight a 3-round exhibition, and he could make a lot of money that way. He didn't even have to fight, really. That's how big his reputation was. And crowds would gather just to see him, show up and sign some autographs. There were always efforts to bring him down. And he always sort of came out on top. The big one for me was in the 60s. One of his managers spread the rumor that he had loaded his gloves for his fight with Jess Willard. He had fought with plaster of Paris in his gloves, and Dempsey, of course, denied it, and he sued Sports Illustrated for printing the article, and he won the legal suits, but there was always that little rumor. Oh yeah, Dempsey, he loaded his gloves, and it wasn't true. There was even a scientific experiment done by some guys in a lab somewhere, using the argument or the accusation of putting plaster of Paris around a man's hand and then putting a boxing glove on, to see if that would, they just said it was nonsense. And the other thing was that when Dempsey came into the ring, as all fighters did in those days, you didn't have your gloves on. You came in with your hands taped, and they would put your gloves on in the ring. All right, and there was even film footage of that, which destroyed the story right there, because his manager had given this long, detailed story of how they did it in the dressing room, and then they put the gloves on, and this and that. It was all a lie. But Dempsey became very successful with a restaurant in New York, and it became almost like the Statue of Liberty. If you went to New York, you had to visit the statue, and you had to visit Jack Dempsey's restaurant. So he sort of maintained a colorful figure. He did come up against some rumors and accusations, and he always fought them. He always said they were untrue, and he would generally come out on top, but those little rumors would always persist, because people like to shoot down big public figures, and if they vaguely remember some old story, they'll say, oh yeah, I heard this about him. The Army thing was interesting too, because he fought that in court, and he came out on top. But in court, they found out that he had been married to this woman who ran a whorehouse, and so that didn't look good for the champ.
Ooh, yeah.
And so he had to play that down, and he also had a brother who died of a heroin overdose, and he had to kind of deal with that. So he had a lot of things going on in his personal life that people wanted to bring him down, but Dempsey was a pretty big figure. He was also in that sort of era of sports where the movie newsreel was first coming into play.
Okay.
And so the films of his fights would be shown in movie theaters around the country, and I think in Europe too. And so people would see him. It could be a fight he had 3 or 4 years ago, but they would see it in the movie theaters, and it would seem like it just happened, and they would come out of the movie theaters buzzing about Jack Dempsey. He was a larger than life figure.
Cool. Interestingly, one of the names on your list you put down is Archie Moore. And the reason that interests me is because if we talk about transcendence, obviously you know better than me, probably transcended boxing in America. But interestingly, I always think of when I think of Archie Moore, I also think of Ezra Charles, who beat Moore I think on a couple of occasions, and yet Charles, despite winning the world heavyweight title and actually fought Joe Lewis and won that on points, it especially back then the world heavyweight title was the pinnacle of all sports. He didn't seem to transcend in the way Archie Moore did. Why was that?
A lot of it was personality. Archie was just a guy who said funny things. Um, he wore colorful robes. He scored knockouts, which appealed to the public and to the journalists. He scored knockouts. Um, Ezzard, who is in the back of the book, he gets an honorable mention because Ezzard beat Archie a few times.
Hmm.
As Ezzard was great, but he was not as colorful. He was not as exciting. Um, Rarely said anything memorable. Um, hard to compare him to anybody in more recent years. Um, he I don't want to insult him and say he had no personality. I wouldn't say that, but he had a quiet personality. Um, I mean, Ezra Charles was an interesting guy. He loved music. He played the stand up bass. Sometimes he would jam with jazz bands. I don't know how good he was, but he loved music. He was just such a quiet personality that journalists didn't know how to deal with him, and fans didn't know how to deal with him. Um, and then he beat Joe Louis. Everybody was kind of hoping Joe Louis would win and regain the title. That was what America was hoping for, because Joe Louis was so popular. And then Ezzard beat him. Um, it was He had a lot of things working against him, but he was a great fighter, especially in his younger days as a light heavyweight. And in his two fights, he had two fights with Rocky Marciano, and he lost both fights, but he showed a lot of courage and stamina in those fights, and especially the first one. He went nose to nose with Marciano for 15 rounds, which not many people could do. Uh,
Hmm.
so he was undoubtedly a great fighter. He just didn't have the personality, and that's unfortunately I know in America that's true. That if you don't have personality, you don't get noticed, no matter how good you are at your sport.
Yeah. Half of the people on the list, I think it's about eight, if I've counted correctly, are heavyweights. And that seems to be something which gives them an advantage. Heavyweight's always the pinnacle of a sport. It's not probably not so much now of MMA and mixed martial arts and whatnot, but it's a pinnacle of the sport. It was the one where if you were that, then you were seen as the toughest man in the world. So imagine just being in that weight division would give someone more of a stage to display themselves as opposed to say if you're like heavyweight or if you well I say featherweight but you got really pep on the list but if you're a lightweight and so on and so forth some of the lower weight divisions would that again is that fair to say?
Yeah, that was always the case with American fighters, and I'm sure to some degree that was true in other parts of the world. Um, Probably less so in an area like Japan, where there were no heavyweights. They were all
Mhm.
smaller guys. So if you were the featherweight champion in Japan, you got a lot of coverage. But in America, they always liked the big guy. They always liked the knockout. Um, I think if um, a, there were some good fighters in the lighter weight classes who were able to get a lot of coverage, but mostly it was the heavyweights. I think that may have gone way back to the days of John L. Sullivan. He was the heavyweight champion. If John L.
Mhm.
Sullivan had been a middleweight, maybe he wouldn't have been such a big deal. Uh,
Mhm.
yeah, America has always loved the bigger fighters. Um, just just the idea of light heavyweights. Um, that division took so long for anyone to, you know, become interested in. It was always considered almost the stepchild of boxing, you know, and and uh, and I think because they called it light heavyweight, I,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
I think that worked against it. You know, they should have called it something else. But heavyweights were um, they were fun to watch too because they were big men and some of them could really move. Uh, even guys like Joe Louis, you know, was a heavyweight, but he was kind of light on his feet, you know. And the guys like Jim Corbett, you know, Gene Tunney certainly, and they would be small by today's standards. But back then they were considered, you know, big men, and they were agile. So it was kind of interesting to see bigger guys be able to move around with that kind of speed, you know. Whereas if you see a, you know, 118-pound guy who's fast, well, so
Mhm.
what? He only weighs 118 pounds. He's of course he'll be fast, you know. But to see a 218-pound guy be fast, that has always been kind of intriguing for the public.
Yeah, indeed. One name again on the list who ended up, I think it's in the second part of his career why he's on this list, and that's George Foreman. If anyone wants to have an example of someone who can really change their personality and come back a completely different person, not just in boxing but in sports, George Foreman is that person. And I imagine he's on the list because his transcendence. There was a bit of it, obviously, in the 70s with the Rumble in the Jungle and whatnot, but in the late 80s all the way up to the late 90s, I think that's when you really see his transcendence into popular culture.
Yeah, if he had stayed retired and never came back, I don't know if he would have made the book based on just the first part of his career. Uh,
Mhm.
maybe I would give him an honorable mention because he beat Joe Frazier and he beat Ken Norton, and those were big important fights. So you know maybe he would get an honorable mention or something. Um, but because of that second half of his career, uh, I think he did sort of become like an Ali or like a Dempsey. You know, he became this big figure in the sport and he transcended the sport, and uh, he made a lot of people happy when you think about it. A lot of people liked hearing about
Mhm.
George's comeback, um, and the public was into it before the press was into it. The press did their best to shoot him down. Um, you know, I don't know if you remember, uh, but the press they were cynical about George coming back. You know, and but the public they were buying tickets. You know, and they were buying the pay-per-views. The public got behind George long before the press did. You know,
Mhm.
um, and then of course when George finally retired, then the press kind of jumped on the bandwagon, you know, saying,
Mhm.
"Oh, it was such a great comeback, such a history-making comeback," and blah blah blah. You know, the public was behind George uh, long before the press.
Cool. One person who's on the list, and I've spoken about this person on previous podcasts, as someone who, the way they transcended the sport, you don't even get a sports star do this, even in this day and age, especially social media and the internet. And that's Mike Tyson. I think people who are younger, I mean, I'm in my coming up to my mid 40s. I think people who are in their like like less than 40 years old don't realize how transcendent Tyson was as a force of nature. Even if you didn't watch boxing, just him as a person was so transcendent. As I said, you don't even get that now with, never mind celebrities, just a lot of athletes in general. Like, just subscribe to people. Bear in mind, this was the 80s as well, you had no internet. How Tyson managed to transcend the not just a boxing, but a boxing world, but culturally as well.
Yeah, Tyson. Again, it was the heavyweight thing.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
If Tyson had been a welterweight, it wouldn't have happened. You know,
Mhm.
um, he was a heavyweight. He was a knockout puncher, all action, um, and he was young too. I think that had something to do with the appeal. I think the press and the public, they liked the idea of this really young guy. Uh, I think he was 20, the youngest heavyweight champion ever. I think that was appealing for a lot of people. They just love the idea of this young, exciting kid, because for a few years, boxing always goes in, peaks and valleys,
Mhm.
um, and there had been uh, a lot of boxing coverage in the 80s, uh, but when Tyson came along, it was during a slight dip, because uh, Ray Leonard was still the biggest name in the business, but Ray Leonard was starting to pick his opponents and only fighting every couple of years. And people wanted somebody who was really going to come out and create some excitement. You know, they didn't want this guy like Leonard who was only fighting occasionally. They wanted somebody to come out and really excite them, and that was Tyson. You know,
Mhm.
the press jumped on it. Um, he had the New York connection too. Uh, that excited people. I don't think there'd been a real New York figure in boxing in a while. Whereas it used to be, all the fighters came out of New York at one point. Um, so he brought that back. Um, so for 3 or 4 years, he was the biggest thing boxing had seen in a long time, and he couldn't make it last. And it sometimes I think it was impossible to expect it to last. You know,
Mhm.
um, something that big is bound to fall apart. You know, and it did. And he went to prison, and it was never really the same after that. It became almost kind of a media freak show after that. It was so different, um, very different, and he liked playing the bad guy. He liked playing the villain, and also I think he had a lot of mental issues. He was always in trouble, in car crashes, and um, uh, biting Evander Holyfield, But in a way, kind of like Jack Dempsey, no matter what Tyson did, a large part of the public still supported him.
Mhm.
You know, I can't imagine another fighter biting his opponent
Yeah, yeah.
and still being like a beloved character. People would say, "Oh well, that's just Mike." That's just Mike being Mike. He's crazy. People kind of like that. Um, but yeah, for young people, I don't think they can understand how big Tyson was. They don't understand how big Ali was. You know,
Mhm.
um, because I think Ali was even bigger than Tyson because he represented something important, to the public, to the black communities. I think Ali represented more than Tyson. I don't know if Tyson ever stood for anything. I don't know if
Mhm.
Tyson was important in the way Ali was. Um, but he was kind of this larger than life figurehead, and he knew how to do it too. He knew how to just say something kind of menacing, at a press conference or something. He knew how to do it with just a little bit of a short, cryptic sentence. Tyson. It was funny because the worse Tyson got in the ring, the better he
Mhm.
got
Yeah,
at
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
marketing himself as a madman. You know. Um, but yeah, younger people, they have no idea about Mike Tyson. And even I know a lot of people put his old clips on YouTube and on social media. They'll show him knocking out some guy who really wasn't that good, you know.
Yeah.
And to me, that's almost like a disservice to him. You know, I don't judge Tyson's greatness by, the way he knocked out, some unknown opponent in 30 seconds. That to me, that's not a big deal.
Mhm.
For me, the Tyson era is when he was, defending against guys like Frank Bruno, and um, uh, Tony Tubbs. You know, um, those, those were good fighters. They weren't great, but they were very good fighters. Even guys like Razor Ruddock, he's a pretty good fighter. You know,
Mhm.
um, and Tyson started looking worse. The better the competition got, Tyson started to look a little worse. But you can't blow everybody out in 30 seconds. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of juice in the Tyson story. Now, an interesting thing: if I had written this book 20 years ago, everybody was sort of against Tyson at that point because he
Yeah.
had lost 3 or 4 fights in a row.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, he was really sort of at the bottom of his popularity. He had not really reinvented himself yet as the guy he is now. This sort of likable, cannabis smoking, podcast guy, the sort of lovable 60-year-old man. He hadn't really reinvented himself yet. So 20 years ago, I remember, writing for a magazine. I was writing for The Ring, and there was some debate over whether he would go in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah. Gosh.
And now it just seems like such a no-brainer. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's so obvious that Tyson would go in the Hall of Fame. 20
Mhm.
years ago, people were saying, he's lost a bunch of fights. Lewis beat him up. Holyfield beat him up. Was he really that good? There was a real negative reaction to Tyson back then.
Mhm.
So, but writing the book now, he's kind of overcome that, valley in his career. Um, it's that was something I noticed about all the fighters in the book. Just about they all had that peak and valley type thing in their career where they would lose their popularity for a while. The audience would be against them for a while. Happened to all of them. You
Mhm.
know,
Yeah.
because that's part of the business. If you stay in the business long enough, somebody will not like you after a while.
It's like that in the film The Dark Knight. If you stay too long, you'll become you either die here or stay too long enough to become the villain. Something like that anyway. And it seems like like especially boxing where boxers hang around for far too long, that seems to be the case a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it's a very interesting list for sure. One thing I was going to ask you is, if I imagine if you were doing it for the 20th, 21st century, so the last 25 years, and you're just doing it for American boxers, possibly outside of Mayweather, and maybe you'd struggle a little bit. What obviously you talk about TV because a lot of it's pay per view now as well. But what other reasons would you say you would struggle to find, say 10 immortal American boxers of the 21st century? Because there must be copious reasons why.
Yeah, it is. A lot of it is like what you said with TV. Uh, it used to be such. It was so easy. You would just turn on your TV, and it seemed there was boxing on in America. Um, Especially for there were a few years in the '80s where Saturday and Sunday you would see fights all afternoon. It was kind of amazing in a way, and good fights too, not just easy fights that they could put together for TV. There were good guys like Edwin Rosario you would see, and Hector Camacho, and Chavez, and you would see guys like Mike McCallum, who was one of my favorites. Um, you would see a lot of these interesting fighters just on free TV, you know. And the guy I mentioned a while ago, Ray Mancini. Um, at one point, Ray Mancini uh, was the one of the highest paid athletes in the world, which is an interesting thing to think about. Um, and it was because he was on TV all the time, and he was a likable guy, and he was Italian. I think that had something to do with it. The idea of the Italian boxer has always been popular in America. Um, so now you don't really get that. You don't get that instant exposure. My mother knew who Ray Mancini was.
Mhm.
um, and that's kind of a litmus test. If your mother knows the guy,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, he's famous. He's done something to transcend. But now, if a guy like Ray Mancini was around now, he'd be fighting on these, apps. You know, he'd,
Mm.
he'd be fighting on an app or on some obscure pay-per-view deal or something. He'd be struggling to get coverage, um, and it's a very different world now. I don't know if uh, America will have a fighter who transcends the business. Uh, if I mean Floyd Mayweather, he transcended the business not because he went 50-0. He transcended the business because of all the money he made.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
if you look at the coverage that Mayweather got from uh, platforms like Forbes, Forbes magazine would do a story on Floyd Mayweather, not
yeah.
because of his fighting skills, but because of his money.
Mm.
You so in a way, you have to make so much money now before you can transcend the business, because that's really what a lot of people are going to focus on. Your
Mm.
money and your living quarters and how many cars you own, and that's really how you can transcend the business. Now look at a guy like Terrence Crawford, um, who's probably as good as any fighter has been, you know, in the last 50 years. I think Terrence is right up there. Um, but has he received any kind of mainstream coverage?
No, not really.
Very strange. What does he have to do? Even if he beats Canelo, I don't think he's going to get mainstream coverage. He won't get it until he's got, 150 million dollars for one fight or something. Some
Yeah,
crazy
yeah,
some crazy number. And I probably am underestimating the amount of money it would take, because it's really that's what the mainstream looks at now, is just the money. Um, Whereas again, going back in time, a guy like Rocky Marciano, all right, who's in my book. Um, Rocky made good money, nice money for a boxer or an athlete. But when the mainstream wrote about him, they didn't write about the money. They wrote about the town he lived in. They wrote about the Italian connection. You know, um, yeah, they might write about the undefeated record, but mostly they wrote about him because he was kind of a nice guy. He was kind of a family man,
yeah, yeah.
sort of an everyday kind of character. Um, that was what they liked. They would take pictures of him, going to church on Sunday. Or it was such a different era back then. Now, he'd have to be driving a fleet of Rolls Royces, and and he'd have to be producing albums for somebody, or he'd have to be, branching out. He'd have to be this kind of super businessman. You know, the mainstream is very odd now. They focus so much on money, and maybe that started a little bit with Sugar Ray Leonard. Um, and I mentioned that in the book because I think he is one of the immortals. But I think the change came with him, where
Mhm.
suddenly he was making so much money that that's all anybody really wanted to talk about. You
Mhm.
know, every headline about Leonard was, $1 million for this, $1 million for that. it became a money game
Mhm.
with Leonard, and it's kind of stuck in that. It's almost like the needle is stuck right there, you know. Um, it's just money. So unless Terrence Crawford can start generating those billions of dollars, he's not going to get that kind of mainstream coverage, which is unfortunate because I think Terrence is great.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. It's been great talking to you about this book. Been really in depth about why he chose his boxers, and why it'd be hard to choose boxers from the last 25 years. Again, from what I've read of it, he's an excellent book. I highly recommend it. Just quickly, in terms of your own writing now, where are you going to go with this? Do you have any other books planned? Do you have any ideas in your head? Like, what's your
Oh,
next
yeah.
stage?
Um, I just I signed a contract with an agent and a publisher in New York, and I have a true crime book coming out probably next year. Um, I spent the summer cleaning it up and getting the manuscript ready, and uh, it should probably come out next year. And another interesting development, and I can't give you too many details. Um, a sort of semi-famous fighter from the 1990s contacted me recently. He wants to write his life story, but you know he's not a writer, so he wants me to write it for him. You know, that kind of thing, as told to Don
Mm,
Stradley, right? I don't want to say his name because right now we're still talking about it. Um, so that's possibly coming up. Um, and yeah, and I have another true crime book in the computer that I'm ready to give that to somebody. Um, I'm talking it over with my agent to see, you know, what the best situation is for that. I wish I could just press a button and all my books could come out, you know, but there's always, you know, you got to haggle with a publisher and you haggle with an agent, and there's always a little bit of paperwork to get through. But yeah, I'd love to just get them all out so everybody could read them.
okay, cool. People want to find out where you more about work. Where can they go?
About this book,
Yeah, about your writing in general. If people want to find
yeah,
out.
you can go on Amazon and just look up Immortals of American Boxing, and also, you know, even though it's hardcover, the price is really reasonable. It's about $26, which is less expensive than a lot of paperback books,
Mm.
and it looks great on any coffee table. And it's a great gift book if there's someone in your family who likes the boxing. This is a great little uh, gift for them come Christmas time in a couple of months. Um, but yeah, they can go on Amazon, or if they want to follow me on X, or as I still call it, Twitter, just they can just find me on Twitter, Don Stradley. I have a link on my Twitter feed that'll take you right to this book, and you can buy it that way. Um, and all my books are on Amazon. If you want to look at the other stuff, I have books on the Hagler Hearns fight. I did a book on Carlos Monzon, Edwin Valero. I have a bunch of books out there, and I say read them all. They're all they're all pretty good, and I had a lot of fun writing them, and there are more to come.
Oh, cool. Dan, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you again. Thank you so much for coming into the 286 project.
Well, thank you, Chris, for having me.